The Bouvier were French aristocracy. That was the story. Old money, European blood, a lineage that stretched back across the Atlantic to the nobility of France, refined and intact, carried into American life without dilution. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy absorbed that identity completely. She built her public persona on it. The French fluency, the aesthetic preferences, the bearing. The story was so well constructed that biographers repeated it for 60 years without meaningful challenge. In 2021, a genealogist named Tina Figueroa, who had spent 7 years building a forensic database of colonial-era American vital records cross-referenced against mid-19th century immigration documentation for the Ellis Island Genetic Heritage Project, ran a search that nobody had thought to run before. She was not looking for Jackie Kennedy, she was looking for something else entirely. What she found stopped her research for 3 days while she checked the methodology from scratch. The Bouvier family was not French aristocracy. The ancestral record, when examined against the sources the family biography had always cited, did not support the claim. Not partially, not in nuance. The foundational story of Jackie Kennedy's paternal heritage, the story she was raised on, the story she carried into the White House, the story that shaped how a generation understood elegance and European sophistication in an American First Lady, was a fabrication constructed in the 19th century by a man who wanted a better origin than the one he had. The forward lock is this: the original fabricator's actual documented birthplace, when it finally surfaces in the record, will connect Jackie Kennedy's ancestry to a population whose history in America is one of the most complex and contested in the country. We will get there. But first, the official story needs to be examined on its own terms, because the most important thing about what Figueroa found is not what it replaced. It is how thoroughly the replacement had been accepted. The Bouvier family mythology was not casual, it was a document. In 1947, Jackie's father, John Vernou Bouvier III, commissioned a privately printed family history titled Our Forebears. The volume traced the Bouvier lineage to the French village of Pont-Saint-Esprit in the south of France, to a family of aristocratic standing with documented connections to the French court. It named specific ancestors. It cited specific dates. It was distributed to family members and eventually cited in published biographies as a primary source. The book was not peer-reviewed. It was not cross-referenced against French archival records. It was, in the language of genealogical scholarship, a compiled narrative, meaning its author gathered available information and organized it into a coherent story, without necessarily verifying whether the sources behind that story were accurate. For decades, nobody checked. The first serious challenge to Our Forebears came not from a geneticist, but from a historian. Kathleen Kendall, a social historian at Fordham University, who spent 4 years in the 1990s examining the documentary record of French-American elite families for her 2001 study on constructed aristocratic identity in the Gilded Age, identified the Bouvier family history as one of several cases where the claimed European pedigree could not be verified against the sources it cited. Her finding was published. It was not widely discussed. The Camelot mythology was still largely intact in 2001, and a challenge to Jackie Kennedy's ancestry was not the kind of story that attracted prominent coverage. That was the first crack. The record had already flagged the problem before anyone had access to the genetic tools to confirm it. Now the resistance enters, and it is real resistance, not a straw man. The strongest counterargument to Kendall's historical skepticism was straightforward. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. French aristocratic records from the 18th century are notoriously incomplete. The Revolution destroyed enormous quantities of parish records and noble documentation. A family claiming origins from that period and that region might legitimately be unable to produce surviving documentation precisely because the documentation no longer existed. Kendall's inability to verify the Bouvier claim in French archives might say more about the archives than about the Bouvier. This is a serious counterargument. Genealogical researchers working on French-American lineages encounter this problem constantly. The destruction of records during the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars created genuine gaps that make verification genuinely difficult. If the Bouvier family could not produce the original French documents, it was at least possible that the documents had simply not survived. That counterargument held for 20 years. It held until the documentary track shifted from France to America. Figueroa's critical finding was not in French records. It was in American ones. The earliest documented American Bouvier, Michel Bouvier, Jackie's great-great-great-grandfather, who arrived in the United States in 1815, had a paper trail in Philadelphia that was extensive and, it turned out, inconsistent with the aristocratic origin story in ways that French archive gaps could not explain. Philadelphia property records, tax rolls, employment documentation, and church records from 1815 through 1845 placed Michel Bouvier in a social and economic position that did not match a man of noble French origin establishing himself in the New World. He worked as a furniture maker and wood carver. The records describe him consistently as a craftsman, not a gentleman. His social associations were with working-class French immigrant communities in Philadelphia, not with the French expatriate elite who were present in the city during the same period and whose names appear in entirely different sections of the same records. An aristocrat arriving in America in 1815 with surviving family connections and education would not have entered the Philadelphia workforce in this way. The social geography of the documentary record was wrong for the claimed identity. This is where Figueroa's work intersected with the genetic track, and where the story got considerably more complicated. The mitochondrial DNA analysis, conducted on biological material from two documented living female-line descendants of the Bouvier maternal line, conducted with full informed consent as part of a broader study on Gilded Age family genealogy, commissioned by a consortium of American historical societies, returned a haplogroup result that was not consistent with the Southern French ancestral origin claimed in Our Forebears, Haplogroup L2a1. Think of it this way. Your mitochondrial DNA is passed to you from your mother, from her mother before that, in an unbroken line stretching back tens of thousands of years. The mutations that accumulate in that line over time create a signature, a haplogroup, that places your deep maternal ancestry within a specific ancient population. Haplogroup L2a1 is a West African maternal lineage. It is one of the founding maternal haplogroups of the African continent, and it is present today predominantly in people of West African descent and in diaspora communities whose maternal ancestry traces to the transatlantic slave trade. It was not present in French aristocratic populations. It was not present in the working-class Southern French communities that were the alternative explanation for Michel Bouvier's real origin. It was entirely inconsistent with any European ancestry story for the Bouvier maternal line. The resistance to this finding came immediately, and it came from multiple directions. The first challenge was methodological. Were the two sampled descendants actually reliable representatives of the Bouvier maternal line, or had there been an undetected break in the female line of descent somewhere in the intervening generations? A non-paternity event, or an adoption that would mean the haplogroup belonged to a different ancestral lineage entirely? This is a legitimate scientific challenge. It cannot be dismissed. The research team acknowledged it directly in the published preliminary findings. Their response was to note that the two sampled individuals were from separate branches of the documented Bouvier female line that both returned the same haplogroup result, and that the probability of an identical undetected break in both branches independently was statistically very low. It was not impossible. But the alternative explanation required two separate coincidences stacking on top of each other, and the documentary record was already pointing in the same direction. The documentary record was pointing there because of what Michel Bouvier's actual origin was, once Figueroa stripped away the aristocratic narrative and read the surviving sources as they were actually written. Michel Bouvier arrived from the south of France. That part of the story appears to be accurate. But the south of France in the early 19th century contained, within its port cities and coastal communities, a significant population of mixed heritage families with roots in the French colonial Caribbean. Marseille in particular was home to substantial communities of free people of color and mixed-race families whose French colonial ancestry was African, Caribbean, and European simultaneously. These families were French citizens. They spoke French. They were, in many respects, culturally indistinguishable from their white neighbors. They were also, in the racial taxonomy of 19th century America, something that required careful management. The fabrication in our forebears was not simply social climbing, it was racial concealment. The aristocratic French lineage served two purposes simultaneously. It elevated the family's social status, and it anchored their identity within whiteness in a country where the alternative had legal, social, and economic consequences that were not abstract. I have read the Philadelphia Record's Figueroa cites. The picture they build of Michel Bouvier is of a man who was skilled, industrious, and careful in a way that goes beyond normal immigrant caution. The associations he maintained, the neighborhoods he chose, the documentation he allowed to be created about himself. The pattern is consistent with a man who understood that the record he left behind would be examined by people who could damage him with what they found. He was right to be careful. He was also apparently very good at it. The concealment held for nearly 200 years. The resistance to the full implication of these findings has come from several directions. Some historians have argued that the haplogroup result, without complete genealogical documentation linking it specifically to Michel Bouvier's maternal line, cannot be used to make claims about Jackie Kennedy's ancestry. That the genetic finding and the documentary finding are suggestive in combination, but not conclusive individually. This is a defensible methodological position. Other scholars have argued that even if the findings are accurate, the framing of the story as an exposure or a revelation repeats the logic of racial categorization that made concealment necessary in the first place, that treating mixed or African ancestry as something hidden and now revealed positions that ancestry as inherently scandalous rather than simply historical. This argument is harder to dismiss, and it deserves more space than it typically gets in coverage of this story. What the evidence actually shows is a family that navigated across multiple generations, a set of social conditions that made their full identity dangerous to claim. The fabrication was not vanity alone. It was survival strategy, inherited and maintained, and eventually so thoroughly embedded that the family itself may have lost access to its own original history. Jackie Kennedy grew up believing she was something specific. The belief was wrong, but the wrongness was not hers. It was handed to her by a family that had been handing it down for over a century, each generation receiving a story that had been true for the generation before in the sense that mattered most. It had kept them safe. There is a pattern here that extends well beyond the Kennedy family. The 19th century in America produced hundreds of documented cases of families with African, indigenous, or mixed colonial ancestry who constructed alternative origin narratives, European, aristocratic, safely white, as a practical response to a legal and social environment that penalized the truth. Genealogists have a term for the process of recovering these suppressed histories, breaking through the wall. The wall is the point in the family tree where the documentation stops, where the names change, where the record becomes suddenly sparse or inconsistent. For many American families, that wall exists for the same reason it existed for the Bouvier. The Bouvier case is not unique in its structure. It is unique only in the prominence of the name attached to it, and in what that prominence means for the stories a culture chooses to tell itself about who its icons were. Tina Figueroa in 2021 was not looking for Jackie Kennedy. She was running a routine cross-reference on colonial-era American records and found a name that led somewhere she had not planned to go. She spent 3 days checking her methodology from scratch before she was willing to believe what the record was showing her. The record was not ambiguous. The wall had been well constructed. It had simply been standing long enough that the tools to see through it had finally been built. What that means for how a culture remembers its icons, what it means when the image that defined elegance and aspiration for a generation turns out to have been constructed over a history that same culture was simultaneously erasing from its legal codes, its schools, and its public life, is not a question that genomics or genealogy can answer. It is the question that remains when the science is finished. And it is, it turns out, a considerably more interesting question than the one the Bouvier family history was designed to prevent anyone from asking.